A large portion of the Jewish nation has returned to its homeland, but the heart, soul, and mind of much of the Jewish nation are still in exile mode. This state of affairs must and will inevitably change. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are speaking with the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
Some cosmologists speak of a multiverse. What is the position of Torah Judaism with regards to this concept?
Well, first of all, we need to define what a multiverse is. What exactly is the meaning of this term? We all know that there is a universe in which we live, in which we reside. We find ourselves living on a certain planet, which is part of a certain solar system, which is part of a certain galaxy, or part of a certain galaxy, which is one of millions and hundreds of billions of galaxies throughout the observable universe. There are cosmologists who have suggested that although this is the only universe that we can observe, there are in fact many universes. In fact, some claim there are possibly an infinite number of universes. The first thing to be said about this concept is, of course, that it is wildly speculative. By definition, if we reside in a given universe, we cannot possibly know anything about, experience anything to do with another universe. It is beyond our ability to observe, to see, to feel, to know anything about. And therefore we are discussing something which is speculative and also counterintuitive, it might be added as well. Certainly it's not something that occurs naturally to the human mind, to reason, to logic. But it's more important to understand why certain cosmologists came up with this wildly speculative idea, which they will never be able to prove, which of course makes it, on the one hand, a very weak and scientifically unimpressive theory, because no proof can be adduced now or in the future for the veracity of such a theory. On the other hand, it's also a very convenient theory, because you can also not disprove it by the same coin. At any rate, it is important to know why certain cosmologists came up with this idea. It has been known to physicists for some time that the basic forces in nature, in the created reality which we see around us, that is to say, the strong nuclear force which binds together the elements, the neutrons and the protons in the nucleus of an atom, the weak nuclear force which has to do with radioactive decay and fission, electromagnetism and gravity. It has been known to scientists for a long time that the values for all these different forces of nature are very, very precise. In other words, if the strong nuclear force were to be only very slightly stronger, or the weak nuclear force were to be only slightly weaker, or if gravity was to be only slightly more powerful than it is, the force of gravity throughout the universe, and the same goes for electromagnetism, if any of these values were changed even minutely, then life and existence as we know it would not be possible. In other words, it's as if the universe, the created universe that we see around us, was set in motion, and its basic forces were calibrated and designed in such a way as to allow for life and human existence and intelligence to come into being. Because if any of these values were to be slightly different, none of this would be possible. None of what we know of reality and our own existence would not be possible. There is also a value known to science today called the cosmic constant. The cosmic constant is an energy force which binds the universe together. It prevents it from expanding out of control or from collapsing upon itself. It has to do with the energy density of what we used to think was empty space or vacuum, which we know today is not really so. And without going into all the details, what we know is that this cosmic constant is very, very precisely fine-tuned. So fine-tuned that it is precise to 120 decimal points. And no physicist on Earth, whether he is inclined to a religious turn of mind or an atheistic appreciation of reality, no physicist can convince himself that a value which is precise down to 120 decimal points is a happy accident. As a result of this fine-tuning of reality, it was concluded by many scientists, even though they were not necessarily religious in their way of life or had been brought up in such a fashion, it was their conclusion that reality as we know it, the universe as it exists in our experience, must have been designed in such a way, very deliberately, by a super intellect or some unknown force, in order to make human life and intelligence possible. Otherwise, it is impossible to imagine why these different forces of nature have those very precise and finely tuned values, because they could have had any other value. They could have been 2 decimal points larger or smaller. This force could have been a tiny bit weaker, or that force a tiny bit stronger, and then everything that we know about reality and life and existence would not have been possible. On the other hand, some scientists who are heavily invested in a worldview in which there is no creator, there is no such super intellect behind the creation of all that we see around us, and seeing that all these values are so finely tuned, they had to come up with some other explanation, so they would not have to admit that there must be a creator, because that of course is unthinkable. So what did they come up with? They came up with a multiverse. How does a multiverse help such people? It helps, so to speak, in the following way. The idea is that if there are an infinite number of universes, in fact, in reality, even though we cannot perceive them, then in one of those infinite number of universes, in one of them, namely ours, it is quite possible, and perhaps even likely, that these different forces of nature would take upon themselves these precise values, and would not be slightly more or less, but precisely the values that we see, that we observe, that we can measure, and thus life as we know it is possible. Whereas in the other myriad of universes that exist in reality, in the multiverse reality which they postulate, there those different forces of nature may have very different values, and then in fact you may not have life, or human existence may not be possible in those other universes. In other words, the purpose of suggesting such a unusual, unlikely, and entirely unprovable notion, such as a multiverse, was simply to get around the most obvious and plain conclusion that logic and reason dictate, and that is that if we see a universe around us, and we know that it came from nothing, as we've discussed on another occasion, that it began at some point from nothing, and on top of that you see that the basic structure of time and space, the basic forces of nature, are fine-tuned to such an incredibly precise extent so as to make our existence possible. This, of course, must lead one to understand, to comprehend that there is a creator, there is a designer, but those who refuse to accept such a thing will do anything at all, including formulating the most unlikely hypotheses in order to flee from the existence of a creator. That is the only true benefit or advantage of postulating this strange and speculative notion of a multiverse.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the Rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the Rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.